Hey everyone, and welcome to a brand new video. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at all the settings in Warframe and how we can utilize them in order to maximize our FPS in game, as well as our overall visibility during combat, whilst also maintaining top tier fidelity. In the first section of this video, we're going to take a look at the settings we can alter in order to squeeze out a ton of FPS while keeping the game looking sharp. Of course, these settings will depend on what you're playing on and what your specs are if you're playing on PC. These settings may or may not be available depending on what platform you're playing on, but with that said, let's get into it with the first set of settings here. So to begin with, you're going to want to open your settings menu, which can be found here, and we're going to navigate over to the video section of the settings screen. Starting off at the top, we have our display mode. This will dictate whether you play the game in windowed mode, full screen, or borderless full screen. If you have a singular monitor setup, so if you're only playing on one monitor and you do not have a second, run the game in full screen mode. This will give you the most FPS, give you control of your video resolution and refresh rate, and is overall just better to use if you want the most FPS out of your game. Now, if you have a multi-monitor setup like I do, so I have a second screen to my right, which I'd like to be able to navigate to, I would recommend running the game in borderless full screen, unless you really want the extra FPS. This allows you to tab in and out of the game without it minimizing, which makes it much easier if you're trying to access Warframe Market on your second monitor, but you still want to be able to see, what items you're trying to sell here. Your aspect ratio is just whatever your monitor is. Most monitors are 16:9 unless you're playing on a widescreen monitor or like a square monitor. Vertical sync, if you want the most FPS, turn this off. This adds input latency and will reduce your FPS, but if you are experiencing screen tear, where you notice that certain sections of your screen move at different rates or refresh at different rates to the rest of your screen, just turn this on. Max frame rate, you want to set this to your refresh rate of your monitor, unless you're not able to reach that. So if you have a 165Hz monitor, but you're playing on older hardware, so you don't find that you're getting 165Hz frequently, and you're maybe hitting 60Hz instead, you're getting 60 FPS frequently, set it to 60. But for the most part, if you've got a decent rig, set it to whatever your monitor is. Brightness and contrast are preference. I have my brightness turned up by 5, but this is all preference and will depend on what monitor you're using. Field of view, this is also a preference, but I would recommend setting it to 90 in order for maximum visual fidelity and just being able to see more on your screen. I'll give you a quick comparison here on the lowest. So this is what it looks like on the lowest FOV. You can see the right-hand side of my screen. I'm going to line it up with this little peak here. If I line that up there, and then I go into my settings, and I crank that up, you'll see I have a much wider FOV. Lets me see a lot more. Super handy in a game like Warframe, and can help reduce motion sickness. If you feel like you're motion sick, crank this up, see if it makes the difference. Show FPS is preference as well. All it does is at the bottom left of my screen, puts a little FPS thing. It's very handy for keeping track of your performance, though if you're running on Steam, you can also run the one that Steam gives you. I have both on because I just haven't bothered turning the Steam one off. As for upscaling, I am running DLSS with quality. This is entirely preference. You don't need this for most of the game. There's just certain areas, like some of the open world areas and the new Entrati labs, which can be a little bit more demanding. So this is again preference. I like it on, if you're going to use it, run DLSS on quality and max out your sharpening, otherwise the game can look a little bit blurry. But if you're experiencing issues with ghosting, which is where textures and the silhouettes of your Warframe kind of like blur when you're turning around and things, then turn this off. As for your graphical settings here, again, this is entirely dependent on the hardware you're using. If you're playing on an older GPU, then maybe you'll want to turn some of these down. For reference, I am on a 4070, so this is what I'm running. However, some of these I would say are pretty universal. GPU particle quality, just go ahead, turn this off. This makes a massive difference to FPS, and also makes the game really cluttered when you're using abilities and weapons that might have high particle counts, like the Arcoplasma or the Ignis Wraith or things like that. Turn this down. It will give you a ton of performance back, a ton of FPS, and it makes it a lot easier to see what you're doing when there aren't 1,000 particles on your screen at once. With that said, anisotropic filtering, you can leave on 8 times. It says decrease to improve performance, but I haven't noticed almost any performance difference. Trilinear filtering, you can leave it on. Again, all of these you can turn down if you're experiencing FPS drops or if you're on lesser hardware. Turn these down. Same goes for these here. Dynamic lighting is fine. This doesn't make a huge difference, but volumetric lighting, local reflections, and SSAO, which is ambient occlusion, these can make big differences to performance. So if you're struggling with performance in certain areas, turn these off. See how that feels. Volumetric fog quality, I would recommend having disabled at all times, really, no matter your hardware. The Entrati Labs, for some reason, which is the new area, has a ton of volumetric fog that you can't really... Like, when you turn it off, you don't notice the difference graphically, but you will double your FPS turning this setting off. It is crazy how much fog there is on the new areas. The next checkboxes here, we're going to have high shader quality on. Doesn't really make a difference to performance, but makes shaders look a lot better. Motion blur, this is personal preference. I prefer this off. Same goes for depth of field. If you're unaware as to what this does, I'll quickly show you. If I turn depth of field on, you'll see when I ADS, my Warframe gets blurred out. So if you look at my Ember, it gets blurred out whenever I ADS, and when I go into my menu, it blurs out the background as well. If I come in here and I scroll down, and I find depth of field and I turn this off, now when I aim in, my Warframe does not get blurred out. I prefer it this way because it allows me to see my Warframe fashion as I'm fighting, and it also doesn't blur out the background, so I can still see what's going on while I'm in my menu. That out the way, where we can carry moving down. Distortions, this essentially can add distortions when you're in full screen. I don't really notice a difference with this, but I prefer it off. Glare, this is again preference. I like it on because it just adds a little bit more immersion to areas that are kind of bright, and it isn't that bad. Foam grain, just turn this off. This adds like a visual noise effect to your entire screen. I don't know why on earth you would ever run this, like ever. There's no advantage to it. It just makes the game look objectively worse. Bloom, you can turn this off if you don't want any bloom, but I like a little bit on and on 10, just so that lights still feel like lights without blinding you. Weapon elemental FX doesn't really make a difference on performance, but it essentially allows you to control whether your weapon has particles on it. So if you've got a weapon, like a melee weapon that's got heat on it, whether that weapon will have heat particle effects on the end of the blade. I like this on. Color correction, I would turn off. This can result in some really weird transitions between bright and dark areas, so I would leave this off. And the rest of these settings, I would leave on. And then down here, if you have a HDR display, you can turn this on, but this is, it says it's experimental. I haven't noticed any issues with this, but I like this. I'll leave this on. Alright, now that we've covered the best settings to change for FPS, let's take a look at what settings we can change to help improve the overall visibility of the game during combat. Alright, for this second section, we're going to start here in the interface tab. It's just to the left of video. There are a few settings here we can change to help make it a lot easier to see enemies and reduce overall visual clutter. We're going to start here with the numerical separators. This essentially, when you shoot an enemy, will dictate how that number comes up. This only really matters if you're not running compact damage numbers, which I'm not. If you are running compact damage numbers, it doesn't really matter that much. This will just compress it down. So if you deal 1 million damage, instead of being 1,000,000,000, it will just say 1M. So this is entirely preference. I like this off because it allows me to keep track of my damage numbers a little bit easier, but again, you can turn this on if you want less visual clutter. Coming down here, you can adjust your HUD margins here. This essentially dictates how much of your screen you use, like where your HUD will end. I just recommend leaving this to whatever your maximum is, but you can narrow it a little bit if you would like. Now here is the main thing. So I would recommend running damage numbers on enhanced. This makes it so that when you shoot an enemy, like if I put this to disabled, not disabled, if I run this on legacy, sorry, and I quickly show you here, you'll see when I shoot this enemy, the damage numbers show up directly where I'm firing, which can very easily obscure your view of what you're shooting at. If I come into here and I scroll down and I change this to enhanced, what this will attempt to do is it pushes the damage numbers outwards from the center point, which allows me to still see more easily what I'm shooting at. The Ignis Wraith is a bit of a bad weapon to use it with because it's a flamethrower, but you can see here, it's a lot easier for me to see and maintain aim on the target when the damage numbers aren't obscuring my vision. So I would recommend having that set to enhanced. You can also then set the scale of your damage numbers here. I have it on 75, but this would depend really on, I think, the size of your monitor. I'm running in 2K, so I imagine this would depend on what size of your monitor you're using. And the opacity I have set to 75. This is also a preference. I like it on 75 because it means that the damage numbers aren't completely opaque. So it allows me to see through them a little bit, which just makes it easier to hit the targets. And then the rest of these abilities are pretty much preference. Show health over enemies I have off, which basically means instead of the enemy's health bar showing up above like here, above their head, it actually shows at the very top middle of my screen. If you see Corrupted Warden, you can see it at the very top. I prefer it that way because when there's a large amount of enemies, it can sometimes get a little bit cluttered, but that is entirely preference and doesn't really have much of a bearing on anything else. As for that, that's pretty much the rest of these settings. For the next bit, we're going to head over to the accessibility. There are a few settings here as well, which are really, really good in my opinion. So starting off here, we've got this is where you can find your colorblind stuff if you are colorblind and you would like to change some of these. But the main things here are visual effects intensity. If I leave this on 100%, on 100, let me head out here really quick, and I switch to my Ignis Wraith. If you pay attention to the actual flames coming out, you can see they are very, like, I can't see what I'm shooting at when I'm firing this. It completely obscures the enemy because it's a flamethrower. However, if I go into my options, I go to accessibility, and I come down here and I turn this visual effects intensity all the way down to 10. You also want to, while I'm here, turn reduce teammate visual effects on. This can stop people griefing you if they're using a very bright weapon. Just turn this on. If I come back out here now and I shoot the enemy, you can see that it reduces the opacity quite a significant amount. So I can now much more easily see what I'm shooting at because it doesn't entirely obscure your vision. It's not a massive difference, but it can make a pretty significant difference when you're trying to shoot targets with weapons that might have a more, like a larger visual effect. So I'd recommend turning this down. You can leave it on 100 if you don't really mind. I kind of use it on 100 a lot because I like to be able to see the weapons that I'm firing, and it is a flamethrower and I don't need to be super accurate with it, but it's worth keeping in mind this is where this setting is if you would like to turn this down. On this same page, I would also recommend turning off screen shake. This is when you have this on, it's very, very noticeable. And when you're firing weapons, or when you're using a melee especially, it can make it very hard to keep track of what's going on when your screen is just constantly shaking. Especially turn this off if you feel motion sick. And finally, on this page, we have this section, character highlighting. This setting was a godsend for me. Without this on, enemies don't have any kind of border or anything, so it can be hard sometimes to distinguish enemies versus certain allies like specters if someone's using Grineer specters and stuff. It also just makes it kind of hard to see. If I come out of this menu really quick, you can kind of see that these enemies, if I didn't have this red outline on them, they're kind of the same color as the background. Like, if I didn't have this on from a distance, they can be kind of hard to see, especially when there's a lot of effects going on, you know, things are on fire. It can be very hard to keep track. So I would really recommend playing around with this setting. You can change the color to whatever you like. I have it on red because red enemy kind of makes sense. As well as the intensity, you can see on the right, if you turn this up, it's very intense. I find 40 is a pretty good amount. You can also turn on ally highlights, which just means that any friendly specters, any friendly crew members, any teammates, they have a slight blue glow to them, making it a bit easier to track them as well. You can also enable self-highlight if you want, but I don't really find the need for this. And that's pretty much it when it comes to accessibility. So yeah, we're going to move on to the next section. Alright, before we end off this video, we're going to go over one last section, and this is going to be bonus settings. So we're going to start here under keyboard and mouse. These settings don't really fit into any of the previous categories and won't affect your FPS or really your visibility, but they are settings that I personally use, and I find they do make the game quite a lot easier to play. So starting here, under keyboard and mouse. Now if you're playing on controller, these settings are like universal between the two. So you can see here, invert tap hold abilities, all these ones here, they're also the same here. So do this respectively, depending on whether you're on controller or keyboard and mouse. I'm on keyboard and mouse, so I'm going to be on this section. Alright, we're going to start off here with invert tap hold abilities. This is a very, very useful screen. So for certain warframes like Gorse, if you have this on standard, when you tap his thermal sunder, it will apply a cold proc to enemies. Now, for the way you want to use him, you actually want to apply heat first and then apply cold. So leaving this on inverted means you can tap thermal sunder to apply heat and hold to apply cold instead of the other way around. I also have it set for Kalervo as well, and I have it set for Gara. This is just super useful if there's a frame you like where you're sick of having to hold the ability to use the version of it you want. Come in here, invert it. Super, super, super useful setting. There's also some settings here, so melee with fire input, turn this on. This essentially means you don't have to spam E or whatever your melee button is on controller in order to melee. You can just equip your melee and then press the regular shoot button, so like left mouse button, or if you're on controller, right trigger, I believe it is, just a melee. This is super, super useful. Turn off melee auto-targeting and melee tracks camera target, as well as align attacks to camera. Turning these off essentially allows you to melee freely. So I can melee while looking this way, I can melee sideways, my melees won't lock onto enemies. It just allows you to have much more fluidity in your meleeing and stops it being kind of weird and tracking onto targets. So definitely turn these off. I suppose you can leave them on if you maybe have more issue with hitting your targets with melees. You could maybe leave some of these on. But overall, I'd recommend turning these off. And that's pretty much it for this section. You can obviously change your sensitivities and things here. But moving on, we can move over to your system. I am playing on North American servers, even though I do live in the UK. I find there's just more players here. So I set my matchmaking ping limit to 200, and I play on North American servers. But double check that your servers are the correct ones that you would like. And you can also enable cross-platform play here. I would recommend having this on if you want the most amount of players. You can also do cross-platform trading with this on. Super, super useful. Social, this is where you can change your... you can disable which chats are available. So I don't like having read and chat on because it just gets spammed a lot. Kind of a bunch of nonsense. As well as enabling profanity filters and things like that, and changing the scale of your chat as well. We've already been through all of the interface settings, so there's nothing really much else to go through here. The main ones are under here in accessibility. So at the top here, there are a couple of things. There are hold to sprint, hold to aim, and fire manual trigger weapons continuously, as well as repeated button presses. I would recommend having this on, and I'd recommend having repeated button presses on hold as well. What this essentially means is that any weapons that are semi-automatic, or like shotguns and things that are rifles, this will turn them fully automatic. It just makes it way easier. It means you don't have to spam your buttons, you spam your triggers, spam your mouse. And the same goes for the repeated button presses. Whenever there's a quick time event where you may have to mash E or mash right trigger, this just sets it so you don't have to smash it, you just hold it. Super, super useful. The settings are also here for controller. And this is where you can also enable hold to sprint or hold to aim weapon. I have hold to sprint off because I find it much easier to just tap sprint and then release, as opposed to having to hold shift the entire time. But yeah, that's pretty much it for my settings. Hopefully you guys found this video useful, and hopefully it helped to increase your FPS and the way your game looks. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe, and if you haven't already, leave a comment. Let me know if any of these settings helped you. And yeah, I will catch you guys in the next video. Adios.